Hello, Psychology 211. This is Beth, reviewing Chapter 11, Age and Cohort. A lot of things in this chapter are probably things you already know, information about aging that doesn't change your intelligence or your personality in any sort of way. So I'm going to highlight some things that maybe you didn't know or things that I think are just in particular interesting. Probably to me, one of the most notable things is a description of the different generations that we have in our country right now. Starting with Generation X, which by the way is me. There's about 17 million of us born from 1961 to 1975. And we also have the baby boomers, who are the biggest group that we have in this country at 72 million. They were born between 1946 and 1964. So a lot of you, I'm guessing, are what we call the Y generation. Y generationers were born between 1976 and 1994. They're called the echo boomers, mainly because the 60 million of you are mainly children of baby boomers. And there are some contrasts between all of these groups, and even contrasts between Generation Xers like myself and Generation Y. For one, many of the Generation Xers like us, we had computers at some point growing up. Most of us can remember when we didn't, and some of us can remember when we got our first one. I was about 12. We didn't have a clue how to use that thing. And we've been able to sort of watch the evolution of the internet and all kinds of technology. If you're Generation Y, you don't know it any other way. You were born with computers. You were born with technology in the information age. Another kind of important contrast is that 1 in 4 Generation Y children grew up in single-parent households. As opposed to the generation before where that wasn't quite as common. Sure, there was divorce, but the level of impact probably wasn't as great for those in Generation X. In Generation Y, you also grew up, I say you because I know not all of you were in that generation, in a media-saturated kind of world where there was TV and cable and brand consciousness and internet and information is easy to come by. And so the way that you as individuals respond to that media seems to be, according to research, vastly different than somebody from my generation or maybe from the baby boomers generation. But certainly that increases the gap between the Gen Y generation and then, of course, the baby boomers, or the most aging of the population. The most aging of the population are really a generation even removed from the baby boomers. The generation gap is a term that was coined by Margaret Mead in the 1960s, really to describe the sort of divide or chasm between the American youths and their parents and grandparents. You know, in Vietnam, that was seen probably really in a large scale for the first time, where young people, especially the men that were draft eligible, really felt like their elders were in control and telling them what to do, and that they were manipulated by their elders. In particular, they were put in danger. You know, they were forced to go off to war and be killed and shot at. So this was the first time in this country we really were able to see that definition in action. Today, that generation gap is evident worldwide. So what we saw in the 60s is now evident all over the globe, and it's got global significance. And you see that there's been a spread of education and influence of mass media now because it's so much more accessible than it used to be. So keep that in mind as we continue to talk about that shift in demographics, where you have a population of aging Americans in vast contrast to a generation of young Americans now. So we talk about there being 39 million 65 plus. So those that are 65 and older, there's about 35 million of them. The oldest of the old, that our book calls 85 plus, are the most rapidly growing. And so you'll see that, again, that's an even larger contrast between generations as well as ethnicity and culture. Just some kind of general truths, again, that you've probably learned in sociology somewhere along the line. We know that men still have a higher death rate than women of any age, and that elderly women are 3 times more likely than men to be widowed. So, there's that kind of joke that when you're a man in the nursing home, you're the most endangered species because there aren't too many of you usually. And that's been my experience in the volunteer work I've done in some of the retirement homes, that there's very, very few men to go around. So it kind of creates an interesting dynamic. I think probably the take-home message from this chapter for me really is that great divide between the elderly, pretty much mostly white Americans, and the young, the millennials as they call them, who really are the same generation as we've been talking about for Generation Y, and maybe even younger now, are vastly, in larger numbers, minority, especially in states such as Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Florida. We're seeing a shift. And our book talks about the gray and the brown, and actually specifically it's brown stain. And you will actually see on the discussion for this week, or the tab for this week, that there's Brownstein's information from the Brookings Institute, and also some information from Frey, that talk about now, for the first time ever, there are more white people dying than being born. So as this elderly population of mostly white individuals dies off, then they're being replaced by minority individuals. And we'll see that in some states, including Texas, that phenomenon has already happened. The prediction was that would begin happening, but they predicted it much further in the future than it actually has been occurring. So even now as we speak in Arizona, for example, there are more Hispanics, for example, being born than white people. And so again, that's representative of the shift that we see overall in ethnicity and culture in this country. And of course, it will spread to other states outside of just the Southwest, where you see it mostly now. But it creates an interesting divide in many ways. You have political and educational spheres mainly controlled by white people, older white people, who are largely more Republican and more conservative and more traditional than our young people, who tend to be more largely Democratic. They believe education is very important. They're concerned about social issues. So there are still many areas in which that older generation controls, say, education. And there are many who feel that education is at risk, in part because our older generation is not understanding of the priorities of those that are young. And the political sphere, it's very obvious as well. Our older Americans are largely Republican and vote that way, while our young people tend to be far more Democratic. The interesting phenomenon to me is that while in fact young people are far more Democratic than the elderly generation, they vote far less often than the elderly. So if in fact you're interested in furthering whatever the agenda or priorities are for younger Americans, then the most important thing you have to do is try to get out the younger vote. That 18 to 24 vote is important because it should be more representative of the values of those that are going to be running the country in the coming years. So as we think about an election coming up, think about the dynamics that are occurring in the world and in this country in particular, where we still have a lot of elderly people in control that seem to be in contrast with what the values are of younger Americans. So until next time for Chapter 12, we'll see you later.